Kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai, and look, a warm welcome to everybody around our extraordinary council meeting for the long-term plan, and for Wednesday the 29th of November 2023. Before we get into things, I'd just like to ask the Deputy Mayor to open with karakia.
Tēnā koe, Your Worship, o te rā tēnā tātou ngā rangatira o te kaunihera me ngā kaimahi katoa. Tū tawa mai I runga, tū tawa mai I raro, tū tawa mai I roto, tū tawa mai I waho, kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Kia ora and thank you. Before we get into the order of business, just acknowledge the housekeeping and safety procedures, the fire and emergency exits there that are listed there, and unlike the event of an emergency, we evacuate to the assembly area next to the clock tower in Te Maraehine, the square. It's a non-smoking facility and there is a defibrillator located in the front of house. The meeting is being recorded and streamed on the Council's YouTube channel, and if I could just ask officers speaking, if they're perhaps just in the first occasion, give their name and title for those online, and we have apologies. We'll go to apologies next. And we have apologies from Councillor Billy Meehan and Councillor William Wood for lateness. He will join us on Friday. So I'm happy to accept those, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. If there are no other comments, I'll ask you to vote, please. Okay, we're having some technical issues. I hope this is not going to happen for the rest of our LTP, but we will do this by show of hands. So all those in favour, if you could raise your hand. And that is unanimous, thank you. All right, no other additional items, and there's no declarations of interest. And the first thing we do need to do is a recommendation around some flexibility in debating in the meeting. So we're looking at option C, which is around moving motions and amendments. That's in our standing orders of 2.12.3, 2.12.1, sorry, and it can be done by a simple majority. I'm happy to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. If there's no commentary, we'll just do this again with a show of hands. All those in favour? And that's unanimous, thank you. All right, before we get into the presentation from our officers and acknowledge them at the front there, again, just a warm welcome to everybody. And before we start, just want to perhaps just make some scene-setting comments before we debate what is going to be probably one of our harder, or if not hardest, LTPs, and start the wider prioritisation process. Firstly, I'm just going to say we're going to take our time, and we'll certainly ask plenty of questions, and I'm not seeking us to move this at any pace, because I can sense there is some uncomfortableness around the table as we're going through this. And look, many thanks to those that have contributed to the LTP process journey so far. Before we start in earnest to shape it, and just to acknowledge the officers that have done a lot of work in the background to make it, but as we shape this, we've got to make it more acceptable to our ratepayers, who are the funders of the plan, and our wider community. I've heard from many of you signalling your concerns from everything from around the information and lack of it initially, but I just want to acknowledge the officers for pulling stuff together very quickly after that. As elected members, just around the timing of the whole making decisions, the large increases that have been signalled and rationale, and for community expectations, and where will community projects sit, even if they are staged within the plan. But above all, the concern most of you had is just the general affordability, or potentially the unaffordability of the total plan. And some of you have said to me, and I do look at this when you get this given to you, the overwhelmingness of it all, and where do you start? Yeah, so I accept all of those. And look, Palmerston North City is not alone in this. It's a sector issue at present, and it's something that I have been signalling personally for some time with my colleagues in Wellington. And it was the real issue for me, and I think number one for the Future of Local Government panel, yet it doesn't seem to have been picked up in the spotlight as it should be. So we're going to need to advocate for that ourselves alongside our neighbours in this space. So that's something that I'll be advocating quite strongly too in Wellington about some further funding and financing tools, revenue streams for our city, but also for the sector. And getting some acceptance around the cabinet table that there does need to be a true relationship between local and central government, because I'm really unsure if we can continue as a sector long term if there is no change coming in funding and finance. On that note, we've had some scope creep too, to be really honest, since I've sat at this table, and in my opinion perhaps we're trying to do too much at times, so that does need to be accepted in some way, and how does the organisation be set up for delivering what really should be core services, and also providing for our community's well-being, but perhaps doing that without automatically filling gaps and partnering with others to do that, and that includes facilities and buildings, etc. as well. I think we're going to do a lot more with partners and source more external funding, and we can debate that as we go through the next couple of days and meetings. So we'll take everything slowly, and we will move through things as we deem fit. I will allow plenty of time. I'm not going to shut anybody down because this is a big discussion and it takes as long as it takes. So we'll go through to the first paper there, and I'll come to you, Cameron, David and Chris, around the drafting of the budget. Over to you, gentlemen.
Right, kia ora koutou. Thanks for those introductory comments, Mr. Mayor. So we're going to walk you through the presentation. We will go through that relatively quickly. We appreciate it's been pre-circulated and want to make the best use of the time for the conversation that will follow. This first slide, hopefully that resonates with you, and there's nothing new on there in terms of the steps that we've followed thus far through the LTP. So looking at the big issues, the vision, goals, the plans, the levels of service, the drop-ins, and now we're into that difficult stage of the process, which is prioritisation. In terms of the purpose of today, hopefully that's relatively clear from the paper and the slides. I guess just to mirror or support some of the introductory comments from the Mayor. Look, I think we acknowledge that we may not have got it quite right in terms of this initial preparation information, and did our best to update those program sheets as quickly as possible and get those out. What I would say, the next 4 weeks is going to involve a series of sprints to get to the point where we can start to prepare a draft LTP for your consideration in early April. So if we're not getting it right, or you've got some feedback in terms of how we're putting together and sharing information, then obviously we want to hear that, because it is going to be a challenging 4 weeks, and we want to make sure that we're working with you to support you to get a draft plan as best we can. I guess what we have done since that workshop in early November is we've shifted from a $3.1 billion capital program to a 2.4, and we've wanted to try and make sure that we're explaining, I guess the consequences and risks that come with that initial shift. We appreciate there's going to need to be a further shift as well. So those program descriptions have been updated and provided now. I think, as the Mayor said as well, I mean, ultimately we're in your hands today as in terms of how far you want to go with your decision making today, or your interim decision making. Bearing in mind you're not making a decision today on the draft LTP, you're making some decisions that will work towards the preparation of a draft LTP. So, and appreciate we are in a council meeting environment, and a lot of the conversations we're having today in the past LTPs, for those members that have been here, will typically be the conversations having today have occurred in a workshop, and certainly officers appreciate, I guess the step implications of having those conversations in the public. So you'll see that as a result of that, we'll sort of soften the language in the slides in terms of how far you want to go today relative to the initial recommendations. So for instance, you look at that first bullet point, if where we get to today is we make some decisions on assumptions, and then there's some broad direction to go away and do some more work rather than explicit prioritisation of line items, then that's okay as well. So, yeah, just a few introductory comments. I mean, I think we've got today and Friday set aside to work through the capital program, and then the 13th and 20th to look at the operating program. There's some flexibility, obviously, to move within those in terms of what we're addressing. But certainly officers are conscious that we still need to be in a position where by the 7th of February, we need to bring you a draft LTP for debate, and all the supporting material that comes with that, from development contributions to financial strategies and those sorts of things. So there is a lot of work to do, and hence that comment about the sprint over the next 4 weeks. I think the LTP is a marathon, but there's some sprints within it. The start point for what's in front of you, we do, the previous council and LTP and annual budgets is part of it, but ultimately this is a new LTP for a new council. So this council is entitled to make whatever decisions it chooses with regards to its LTP. Clearly there's been a significant rollover in terms of large parts of the strategic direction. But ultimately that's the LTP is about what this council wants to achieve. Those list of items in the third bullet point hopefully are things that have come through in terms of the messaging we've had to date, and are reflected in some of the introductory comments from the Mayor about the challenge of this LTP. So the Mark 1 budget, that was the workshop that we talked about, I talked about earlier, sorry, on the 3rd of November. So it was I guess, the starting point to deliver on the plans and what we would describe as prudent asset management. We accept that that's only one part of the LTP. Affordability is also part of it. So we've already, as I said, removed about $700 million worth of capital to get to the Mark II budget. So today we can make some further decisions across those attachments at the rear of the report to move forward. And as I said, we've got Friday set aside as well. At that point, we're on to some graphs, which typically means that it's Cam's turn to talk.
Yeah, thank you, David. So this graph should be is basically a replication of the graph that you would have seen in the workshop. What we've tried to put on there, and yes, it looks a bit like a squiggly line there, but what that was actually the height of those bars at the previous Mark 1 version of the budget. You still see that through the middle part of the 10-year plan, those bars are still relatively high, but there are some big ticket items in there, namely around nature calls and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we're planning on funding, our assumptions on funding for that.
Thanks, Cam. Kia ora, everyone. So just picking up on this, so just a bit of background, some of which we talked about at the first workshop, but just to remind you the concept of the sort of the Mark 1 budget and what we've done between Mark 1 and Mark 2. So the Mark 1 budget was effectively, as David mentioned, it was sort of an optimal asset management view of the world. From that, really, I suppose it's what the team was doing, when it certainly comes to the capital, was sort of optimising around risk and sort of considering asset life cycle issues. Essentially, trying to make judgment calls about, renewing before maintenance got to the point where it was too high, or, you get to the point where the asset fails. So, I mean, in an unconstrained world, where money and deliverability isn't an issue, you would certainly take a very optimised view. Obviously, we don't live in an unconstrained world, so but we felt even more so than what we had done in previous years how important it was to show council what an unconstrained view of the world looked like, and some of the issues that were there. With no malintent, but certainly in the past, I think we've probably done more work to try and get a more affordable view of the world before we've sort of shown that to council. So that's hence why we've done Mark 1 to show you. To make things more affordable, but also to consider issues like deliverability. We've done a lot of work between Mark 1 and Mark 2, and we have reprioritised and reorganised things to try and make it a lot, to address those issues. And we have tried to prioritise our spend to where the highest risks are, and we've tried to spread the cost without having a significant impact on the asset performance. We've also re-looked at some programs, and since then, and thought about how have we really got this as optimal as we can. So things have shifted around, and you've seen that the extra work that we've sent out, and you can see where those each program has shifted between those ones. The other thing that we've showed you there is the difference between sort of year 4 of the current LTP and what we're doing there, and you can see in a number of cases where there looks to be quite a big jump from what we had in year 4 to what we've proposed today, and there's a number of reasons for them. And fundamentally, it is inflation is not my friend in infrastructure. I can tell you that. So in some areas, if you look at what we were facing 3 years ago versus today, we've had cost escalations in the order of 40% in some, particularly sort of roading, construction, and what have you. So that is something that we have to deal with. In the Three Waters, we know that the cost of laying pipe has increased by 25%. So there's quite a bit of that. There's some new things that have that appeared since the last LTP, and some of those you'll know from the sort of new legislative requirements. So things like certainly the new water legislation has come in, and we've had to factor those sort of things in. So yes, there will be you'll look at the last LTP and you'll look at this one and you say, well, that looks quite different. Well, that's and there's probably 20 other reasons as well, but certainly also our I guess our knowledge of our assets is improving all the time. So some of that is knowing what we don't know, but a lot of places we just have better asset information to be able to base that on. So so that's basically what we're showing you there, and again, like just in the to a large extent in the interest of transparency. Moving from Mark 1 to Mark 2 doesn't necessarily come free, and one of the things that we will face, of course, is some high risk. So we are taking on a high level of risk and that is because we don't live in an unconstrained world, and we do need to give you our best advice about that balance between taking on more risk, but trying to sort of manage the affordability. The Mark 2 budget, so in terms of this graph, what this is trying to
illustrate for you, and I'll explain a little bit about the red line that runs across the page here. At the moment, that red line is on an assumption that the debt limit for council would be 250%, not 200% as it currently is. You still have to decide whether that is something you wish to do. But to illustrate, I guess, what we're facing and what we're having to try and achieve, to have a forecast borrowing that fits within what is covenant debt limits and also an acceptable debt limit that we might set. Really, we need to get in these bars underneath that red line, and that's what audit will be also looking for us to do from a prudent financial management point of view. Okay. This graph here is really what we're trying to show here. So if you thought about that capital program that you saw in the first graph, how does some of the assumptions that we are proposing and suggesting to you, the use of IFF funding, Waka Kotahi funding, and any other sources of funding, how does that compare against what council itself has to fund? So you can see that through the middle part of the 10-year plan, we've got some assumptions in there that suggest that we would be drawing down significantly at IFF based funding at this point, and that's been taken into account in this Mark II budget so that you can see the impact that has. I think largely a lot of the points on the slide have sort of been covered already, except I just want to make one point here. So whilst we're suggesting that we're going to need to increase our debt levels, it is worthwhile just have in the back of our minds what the impact of that is in terms of the debt servicing aspects, and that's what we're trying to demonstrate with 20 million of loan funded programs. Each increase of 20 million is about 1% of rates in debt servicing and payment costs.
Just in terms of the broader context, again, some of these, or most of these, have been touched on already. You'll be aware of them. The vision, goals, strategies, and plans have informed the work to date. Chris has touched on the high inflation. We're all aware of the central government reforms and the pending change regarding the Three Waters legislation. We're coming off the back of, a bold and ambitious strategy for the city in terms of a lot of those strategic projects. We're seeing increases in standards across a range of activities. Stormwater is one that comes to mind. We've got better information on our assets and conditions and costs. So in the last 3 to 5 years, we've stood up a new asset planning division that is looking more closely at our assets and what's required to manage them. Nature calls you're all aware of. The growth assumption and the relationship of that to the NPSUD and the requirements. Once you assume a certain level of growth, then there are implications that come from that in terms of the planning and infrastructure that flows from that. Earthquake-prone buildings, we're aware of the legislation there and the requirements on us. Some interesting media starting to emerge about whether or not that legislation is affordable over the weekend. Funnily enough, from a new mayor who was previously the minister that passed the legislation, who's now saying it's unaffordable, which is interesting. And then we've talked a number of times through the LTP process about the step up required in investment in transport. So.
So just to touch back on the debt limits, so a bit of background around them. I think most of you will be aware that council funds its new infrastructure and new builds through debt. Caveat that a little bit by it's through debt, and if there is any other external funding available, we apply that to to the funding sources. We do this because there is a recognition that people benefit over the life of the asset that's constructed, and so by funding the initial build through debt, that spreads that cost over that life cycle. Council is required to set debt limits to ensure financial sustainability and prudence. We'll see in the next slide that there is an overall covenant that our where we access our debt has for councils, and that's to ensure that councils maintain that ability to service and pay for its debt. And whilst there are a series of limits around debt, the main one that we're concerned with really is the net external debt as a percentage of total revenue. So just be mindful as well that you do create some capacity as total revenue increases. It does naturally create some capacity, but depending on just how much you require, we're suggesting at the moment that we would need to see an increase in the limit from where it's currently at. Just a little bit more further background. So our current policy debt limit's 200% of total revenue. The LGFA's maximum limit is 280% for us as a council. We at the moment are sitting around about the 150% total revenue. But I guess something to keep in mind, remember when we're talking about total revenue, things like the one-off better off funding and that sort of stuff that we've received currently and is in the books, that does come through in the debt limits. So once those sorts of one-offs roll off, that number will go up a little bit unless we can replace it with other sources of revenue. I guess around the country, that varies as to where other councils sit depending on where they are in terms of their respective council priorities. Certainly, many of the metros are sitting up at that maximum LGFA limit. Our view, or our advice at the moment is not to get to the LGFA limit by coming in at 250%, and the reason behind that is if something happens, and inevitably it can in the future, to have some sort of resilience in the headroom to be able to respond to any future unknowns, I think is important. Of course, once you're up at the maximum limit, and some councils do live up there, it gets really quite difficult to respond to that. And also, if you think things can change from LTP to LTP as well, so to have some room available for the next LTP. I should just say on there that, and it's covered in here, that the debt limit is a limit. It's not necessarily a target. So you might progress towards that limit, but we're not necessarily suggesting we're aiming to get to that limit straight away. Again, because things change, priorities change over time.
So renewals, back to me. So the first part, the first lot of information is all around the renewals. As it says there, this is our expenditure to keep our current set of assets up to spec. And it's funded over a three-year period. So it has a much bigger impact on rates than, say, a capital program, but less so than operational and what have you. So look, just in terms of some key points around what we've done here. So there is some big increases in some of the renewals. So roading in particular, you'd all be expecting that given what we've been talking about. So we've increased that a bit. I think if you look at the number within the on the second page, David, the number in the last LTP compared to what we've suggesting is not a massive move, but we are looking at a steady set up over time. Compared to the Mark 1 budget, what we have also looked at doing has just been a bit more of a managed step up. So rather than a big step in the first year, we've sort of looked to sort of try and bring that in over the first 3 years, and then we settle around that sort of 45 million from there. A couple of other things that we have considered. So we've just looked at this, particularly over those first 3 years. We've just thought about it, going back to my previous comments around the affordability and achievability. It does bring in some level of risk. So, if you're going to delay your renewals, obviously, potentially your reactive or even program maintenance could increase, because you have got an asset that is older than what you would ideally have. But basically, I guess what we're putting to you is saying that, we've tried to make a balance with that, and what we're putting to you is we think is a reasonable balance between the risk that we take on and the affordability. So that's why we're recommending that.
Just a couple of points around this. Around the water activity, you'll be aware there's been quite a bit of uncertainty around whether waters are in or they're out. We have at this point got 3 waters in the 10-year plan. There is a commitment at this point to repeal the 3 waters legislation. What that looks like and what's replaced with, I guess that's still to be uncovered. The key thing from us, I guess, out of this slide is we have our Nature Calls project that the expenditure for this is going to be in this 10-year period. What we're suggesting is that we would assume that project is funded through a special purpose vehicle or through the infrastructure funding and financing arrangements. We are able to access that for that type of spending. That's our, I guess, based on our current position of how we've got 3 waters as an activity in this LTP. The thing, I guess, that I just want to highlight those, with an IFF, ratepayers still have to pay that levy, so that's something we do have to consider when we are thinking about the overall affordability when that time arrives. Obviously there's a fair bit of work to go through to actually understand when we get to it what that is going to mean. If we move on with that assumption, then we would be going away and working out the details, and there's still a bit of details to work out around the I guess what ultimately it's going to cost, and if there's any other funding that might come from other sources as well. Any other funding that we can access, if we could access any other funding, would be of use when we're thinking about that levy.
All right, just changing tack now a little bit in terms of the growth programs, which I think are attachment 3. So as you're aware, growth programs fund the infrastructure needed for that network infrastructure needed for new dwellings and business premises. Developers still have a responsibility for providing local infrastructure. At the moment, our main tool to recover the costs of those is the development contributions policy. But the way that mechanism works is that it can be 20 to 30 years after you make the investment before you get the final recovery of the costs that were borrowed to support that growth. So if you have an area like Kakatangiata and you put in place some infrastructure for growth that's spread across the entire development until the last house or last subdivision is built, you don't recover the cost of that. So I guess, as I said in the introductory comments, ultimately once we make some growth assumptions and work backwards from those or forwards, that commits us to some certain obligations around land supply and infrastructure. We could, it's certainly by no means an excessively high growth assumption, so it's not I think the mayor's used the term "we're not punch drunk on growth." It's a realistic growth assumption that we've adopted. I also wouldn't recommend that we sort of shy away from growth and go back to a low growth scenario, because ultimately there will be a whole lot of macroeconomic drivers that influence the growth and development of the city that in a lot of cases are outside of our control. Bearing in mind we do have a lot of levers we can pull as well. So thinking about the Mark II budget in terms of some of the changes we've made to try and fit within the debt envelope that Cam explained earlier on, the first thing we did initially was to spread the growth programs and move some out of the 10 years. That would ultimately mean a slight delay to the rezoning of some of those areas that we've talked about. That was the first thing we did. And I guess that made some gains in terms of the affordability challenge, but it didn't necessarily resolve all the problems. So I guess what we have done though within attachment 3 is made sure that there are infrastructure programs to service the areas that are already zoned or about to be zoned. So Aokautere, Whakaronga, Kiki Whenua, Matangi and the current industrial zone, Northeast Industrial Zone and the Stage 1 extension out from Richardson's Line. We have programs council funded in the first 10 years to support those. What we have done is delayed, as I said, the first thing we did was delay some of the programs for those areas that are not yet zoned, Kakatangiata and Ashurst, and the further extensions to the Northeast Industrial Zone in Te Utanganui. That will potentially place greater reliance on urban intensification. Because that didn't really get us far enough in terms of the affordability challenge, the other thing we've done, which is recommending, as a new recommendation for you to consider, is identifying Kakatangiata and Ashurst as two growth areas that are yet to be rezoned as being funded through an IFF or external funding similar to that which we've recommended for Nature Calls. We're suggesting that this could form part of our city deal conversations with government, and I think tactically a conversation around growth is a good conversation to be having with the government, maybe rather than in terms of government support, rather than maybe government support for some of the strategic projects if we think about the incoming government's priorities around the efficiency of the economy and those sorts of things. So ultimately, during the next, if this recommendation is approved, because it helps with the debt situation, if this recommendation is approved, but during the course of the next 3 years we do not get a positive response in terms of IFF or external funding, at that point I think, depending on the broader situation in the next LTP, we would potentially have to look at a broader review of the growth strategy as to whether or not it's affordable. So one thing I would say too, just on that, is you know, we're making a series of assumptions at the moment based on the tools and funding mechanisms that we have available to us, or we know that exist. If you look at some of the coalition agreements, there's, the coalition agreement, there is agreements, there is talk in one of those about potentially starting to look at some of the tools we've talked about around this table about value capture. So if we zone land and there's a significant increase in value, then potentially that increase coming in to help fund growth. So there may be some other tools and mechanisms coming in the next 3, 4, 5 years that assist with some of the problems or challenges that we have at the moment. But for the time being, we've made some recommendations based on the tools that we have available. And by funding those areas that are already zoned or about to zone, we know that we'll be able to address our land supply issues in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years, but it will be beyond that if we don't get some other funding mechanisms that will be in a bit of trouble. So at that point, I will hand to
Back to me.
Chris.
Thank you, David. And David was getting a little bit ahead of himself. Growth was Appendix 2, not Appendix 3. So Appendix 3 is legal and critical programs. Now, just to clarify, we've got some definitions up there, but legal obviously is, things like the seismic strengthening program, the new drinking water standards, of course, fits within things like that, or something we have a contractual obligation around. Critical is, probably not quite as black and white, and you know, there is some view about what you put into critical, but
Chris,
fundamentally,
you're one slide ahead of yourself, I think. There we are. That's better. Thank you.
Pardon?
On the right slide.
Ah, gotcha. Sorry. But fundamentally, the critical programs are ones where, you know, relate to an asset where, you know, if that asset fails or, you know, is going to have a fundamental impact on the sort of a wider network. So, as an example, the duplicating the main from the Turitea Dam to the water treatment plant, you know, that's obviously if that single main failed, then it would have a massive impact on the entire water supply. So, you know, duplicating that main is, you know, considered to be critical. What you wouldn't call critical, though, is if you, while still important, if we wanted to do some safety improvements on an individual street, you know, that obviously doesn't have an impact on the wider network, but would just have it. So we'd call that strategic as opposed to critical. Yeah, back to you, David.
Yeah, I guess in terms of the final attachment, I think it was on one of the earlier slides. Look, I think the way the report was set up was that they were given the debts, the debt envelope situation, that they were all out, and the recommendation was to work through and put them in. But as you said at the start of the session, where you know, it's in your hands how you want to deal with attachment 4, whether they're all in, and we work backwards from that. So. We appreciate that the difference between critical and strategic is not always clear cut, and you know, these are officers' recommendations, but ultimately this is your plan and you can make decisions about those attachments as you please. So I guess in terms of next steps, as we said, we're in your hands in terms of how you want to work through this, whether it's in terms of those specific line-by-line decisions or some broad direction based on the advice and recommendations you've seen. The next steps, I guess, they just reflect the points we said at the start. We've got today and Friday, and then the 13th and 20th locked aside, and then we're into the more formal decision making early next year. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that overview. They're coming in now. All right, we will go to Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I have got a lot of questions, but I'll just ask a few, and then if you feel I've gone too far, you can pass on to the next person. I've got a lot of questions, Cam, about the IFF model, which I realised as I went through the papers I wasn't very clear on how it would work. So could you give us a kind of a IFF 101 about how you set them up, how long they take to set up, what the criteria are, who pays, what the level of the levy is? Because I feel that without that information it's quite hard to agree on an IFF for something, and I just don't have that information.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I'll attempt my best to give an answer, but you may have follow-up questions. So the IFF is a funding and financing tool for infrastructure it's been around for a little while, but is only sort of starting to be used now. Tauranga and Wellington have them in place. In terms of what they can be used for, it's designed to fund council projects, and particularly infrastructural type projects, and of large value. So things, I think they sort of say greater than $50 to $100 million in value. It's administered by Crown Infrastructure Partners, so they're the agency that administer it. Effectively, what it is that they borrow on council's behalf, essentially in a separate off-balance sheet way to councils. They raise debt for us on our behalf. By doing so, it creates an obligation that needs to be repaid, and At this stage, I think their 10 years a 30-year payback period, and it commits a levy to the group of people that we agree will ultimately pay for it. So why am I not being specific to who that group of people is? It could change depending on the circumstances of what the thing that's being funded. So if it's a growth area, for argument's sake, if it's a growth area, you may ring fence to the people who are going to benefit from that particular area. If it's something like Nature Calls, where it's a citywide, you might decide that the levy is over that. It is quite a process to go through. It's not something that once we've made that assumption, it's suddenly there and we're raising that levy. It will be coming back through the chamber around what does that actually end up looking like, and the details of that need to be fleshed out on the specific programs as we go through. So I guess in terms of the amount that a ratepayer could pay, that is difficult to say here and now, because you need to make a whole series of decisions there around how you're going to distribute that levy, and that could be even around is there a group that benefits more than another group? Just like you have differentials on rates, you might have some sort of differential mechanism even on the levy. But once it's committed and in place, it is a legal obligation that then has to be repaid. It will show on basically on a line on the rates bill to the person who's paying for it. So we act as an agent. It's not a rate, it is a levy for that agency to repay a loan to fund a piece of infrastructure that we couldn't fund for ourselves with our debt headroom. Would it be similar to what we would otherwise be charging somebody if we were funding it off our balance sheet? I don't think it would be too different. But that detail would have to be worked out and compared. I mean, being a government agency, I believe that they would have access to financial institutions at a fairly reasonable rate. Bearing in mind LGFA is extremely reasonable for councils.
Okay, thank you. Is there a lead-in time to the setup? Do they take long to set up?
Oh, it can take 12 months, 12 to 18 months potentially to get one up and running. So I guess once we've made that assumption, we want to go down that path. There's a number of things we need to do. We need to make sure that we are locking in the right amount of loan as well. So you have to be fairly sharp on the pencil for what you are funding. And when you're talking about projects that might still be 3 or 4 years away, it will take us some time to actually get to that point of committing to something. It will take 12 to 18 months coming back and forth through the chamber, and it has to go up through the Minister of Urban, it was the Minister of Urban Development and Housing, who that is now in the new government, I'm not yet sure, but it actually goes through a cabinet ministerial sign-off process. The thing that we all have to consider and will be considered by ultimately the minister at the time as well as the impact on affordability. They will actually take into account an element of affordability for what we're trying to do. And of course, we don't know if there's going to be other money tipped in from elsewhere either at this point. Those things.
Okay, that's helpful. So if we look at growth, and the proposal from officers is to fund 2 of the further out developments from an IFF, is there a reason why we wouldn't fund all of the growth programs through an IFF? I'm not clear why we would do the split.
Well, I guess the first thing is we have no guarantee at the moment that whoever administers the IFF or under the new government will support an application for IFF or other external funding. So we wouldn't want a situation, and that's why we've been very deliberate about where we've targeted the IFF funding for growth to certain areas and not others, because we wouldn't want a situation where we have to put up the close sign for investment in infrastructure until such time as we had a yes, no, or maybe from the government or IFF or some other external funder for those areas. So that was a very deliberate part of the recommendation. Look, I certainly IFF funding growth, as Cam said, it was under the previous government, went up through the housing, Minister for Housing and Urban Development. I think, funding growth we think is a realistic opportunity, but it would be a very risky proposition to put all your growth in that basket.
Okay, so is it not equally risky, though, to put the whole of the nature calls on an IFF? Because, I mean, the same arguments that you're advancing, which seem reasonable to me, about why you wouldn't want to have all the growth in one, doesn't that apply to the nature calls decision as well?
We have had some preliminary discussions around whether that type of project would be something that would lend itself to the IFF. Crown Infrastructure Partners said yes, it is. I guess ultimately, though, it will come down to an element of what is deemed affordable in terms of the levy, and that needs to come through a process through the chamber as well. So we still have some time, I guess, on that before we have to make an ultimate decision. But in terms of how we actually fund that program at this point in time, it is a sort of program where to only be part funding it would be a challenge to delivering the program. So we can sort of be reasonably safe to say that actually it's a discrete program of its own right, and you need all of the funding to achieve the full outcomes of that program. And council does have, as it's recognised in the current long-term plan, some real challenges in being able to afford that under its own debt capacity. So I think we do need to put a stake in the ground and say that there is a scheme out there that can fund this. There is a process still to go to iron out the real detail, and there's some complexity in the administrative process. But that is exactly what that type of funding scheme is for.
I think if I could just add to that too, if you in terms of your question, comparing the treatment plant versus growth under IFF, I suspect one of the things the decision makers would look at is the certainty around the return on the investment and the ability to recover revenue. So what you have with the treatment plant is you have the ability to put a line item on the rates bill and get a guaranteed income over the next 30 years. The thing with the growth is that it's probably a higher risk investment for whoever's administering IFF, because if growth slows or if growth chooses to go in another location, which it can through market-led planning, then that return on that investment would be slower or at risk, because you'd be relying on a targeted rate or development contributions. So that's why I think putting all of growth in IFF would be a very risky proposition, but I think they are two different investment propositions.
Oh, that's helpful, thank you. I've got a question about headroom.
Yep, that's fine. It's all part of this.
Okay.
What we'll do, councillors, if we'll stick to the first part of it, which is renewals, and then we'll step it down. But if you've got general questions around what has been asked here, then go for it. Thank you.
Okay. So in your comments about headroom, Cam, you said that it was important that we didn't go to the maximum 280 because that would leave us with no headroom in case of an unexpected event. So what kind of thing were you thinking of for the unexpected event?
So the sorts of things that could occur, and I mean, this is a little bit like looking into a bit of a crystal ball to some extent. Yeah, if you had an emergency event that occurred say, an emergency weather event or what have you, or in our case, one of our earthquake-prone designated buildings failed. At the moment, they are insured for indemnity value because they can't get full insurance value. So at the moment, we don't have necessarily a program to build a new building of replacing one of those earthquake-prone buildings in full. But if, say, something happened to them and they did fall over, you'd want to have some capacity to be able to deal with the situation, because they cannot be insured for replacement value at the moment whilst they're earthquake-prone. Those sorts of things that we don't know might not happen, but if we don't have any capacity to deal with it and they do happen, then we would have no real optionality as to what we could do.
So they councils like Hamilton, who are already at their debt limit then, what would happen to them? How are they proposing to deal with this sort of scenario?
I think different councils will have different levers and options. So I can't speak specifically to their full levers and options that they might have, but a number of councils do have things like reserves or investment funds or other things that they have as part of their wider remit of levers that they can pull. We haven't funded this council funds renewals through its rolling 3-year renewal on rates. Some councils fund it through depreciation funds and build up a fund and that sort of thing. So they've got those sorts of levers. I do know that some councils actually really struggle, who are up at that top headroom, to be able to actually have any real optionality on things that might come up. But each council will have different series of circumstances pertaining to them. If I take, I know of another council who has set a lower debt limit because they have to leave some headroom because they can't get insurance on the bulk of their buildings, because they're in a highly seismic area. So those self-imposed council debt limits are peculiar to the circumstances of the council.
So in terms of looking at risk then, what's the level of risk of increasing the debt limit to 250 versus 280?
Every time you increase the debt limit, it does increase, I guess, it reduces the amount of headroom that you have ultimately, and so that does increase the risk. But I guess when you get to the maximum that you can go, the risk is a lot higher because there are things that could occur that we just don't know about today, and that ultimately is the risk. Leaving 30% there gives you some options to fund for those emergency situations that might occur.
I'll leave it there for now, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Councillor Finlay.
Hey, Mr. Probably I've been through a few long-term plans, and every year we never ever complete them. So really, it's just a very quick question to the CEO. How much of this proposed plan do you think we can complete?
Through the chair, yeah, that's the affordability or doability of the program as things that have been questioned a number of times. I think that the components that you're seeing in the middle part of this particular LTP are high value projects. The earthquake-prone buildings in particular is one of those where there are singular projects that are big money amounts. So you're seeing quite a lot of that in this current LTP compared to what you might have seen previously. So when you think about those individual high-value projects, there is the opportunity to kind of bundle one or two of those sorts of things together and actually go out to a single contract over multiple years if those programs actually stay in place and get those particular things delivered. Achieving the program is still a challenge, and those are conversations that we have had around the table.
So you think we'll be lucky to complete the work plan as it is?
If you think about what it is that, and you know what it is that we've achieved across the course of the number of years, last year's probably our best capital delivery that this council has had for quite a considerable amount of time, and the team are tracking pretty well this year against budget as well. You could go, well, there's sort of in that sort of $80-90 million mark in terms of delivery, and then you add on a few very high value projects that might be 10, 15, 20 million on their own, add a couple of those in, and then you kind of get a bit of a ballpark. So what's that? 140?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And yeah, I have a few questions. Just thinking about where to start in. Perhaps for some of the infrastructure-related programs where there might be within the next 10 years, say, scope for public-private partnership or other kind of investment that we haven't yet explored or landed at this stage. How might we go about, I guess, tagging those kind of opportunities in the long-term plan in a way that potentially gives us some flexibility now and also gives us strong anchors for attracting those kind of partnerships?
I'll start. Chris might want to jump in. Look, I think there are. You have the right to tag, I guess, specific items in the 10-year plan and make an assumption that you would like to have them funded through another mechanism, either be it a future external subsidy or a private-public partnership. We are open to all of those sort of funding mechanisms. The caveat to it that I'll put is when we do tag specific things for that, and that is entirely, I guess, a council decision. We can help provide some advice on the likelihood around some things. Is what we are saying is if we don't get the funding, we'll either have to come back and move something else out, or not do the thing. And I guess that's the statement that we're saying when we're making those assumptions. And so yeah, it can be done.
Great, thank you. And in terms of, I guess, weighing up the merits of things that might go down a public-private partnership path or an IFF path, what advice would you have for us in kind of thinking about those two prospective channels?
I think when we're thinking about things like a private public partnership area, we do have to think a little bit about what the benefit is to the other party. So there are some things that potentially lend itself that way. You could, for argument's sake, if you're funding any property redevelopments or anything like that, and I'm not saying that that's necessarily in or out of this plan, but if there is new property developments or we're replacing certain buildings, you might say, well, actually, there could be an opportunity to partner with a property developer or building developer, and maybe do we have to own the actual building ourselves, or could we be a tenant of the building that we might currently be an owner in? That's an example. You might have some major infrastructure. You might put some assumptions around, say, some of the ring road that perhaps we might tag and say, well, we've got some time to see if we can get a private-public partnership running. Those are probably the types of things that spring to mind, but obviously there's others that might have some views on it as well.
Yeah, thanks, Cam. If I could just add to that, I think when we're thinking about our portfolio of programs, whether it's council funded, partnership, or IFF, we need to be very deliberate and strategic in thinking about, potentially what will tick the boxes of the new government. And certainly my reading is, growth, Te Utanganui, the ring road is more likely to tick the boxes of the the new government than, say, a museum or a stadium or a library. So thinking about those projects, they might be ones where we're more prepared to make an assumption around a partnership. And look, I know, Councillor Barrett, you're in the session earlier this week that we had on the Civic and Cultural Steering Group, and hearing from Tauranga, where they have, as an example, there will be others across the country where they've successfully delivered or in the process of delivering a range of civic facilities and cultural facilities through a partnership model. But the key message we heard from them was that they had some skin in the game. There was still some funding in their LTP to help deliver those projects. So I guess what I would just caution is us making an assumption that all of that funding that we have allocated for some of those more civic cultural facilities comes out and is going to be paid for by someone else, because certainly the Tauranga example was, I think, they were getting about $600 million investment from about $180 million investment themselves. So, certainly it's an assumption you can make, but caution taking it all out on the basis that the private sector or someone else will pay for it.
Thanks. A couple more, if I might, and then hand on. Around the renewals, thanks for softening the blow by offering a 3-year ramp. Would just be interested if there's consideration of perhaps longer ramps or shorter ramps, and kind of modeling that in terms of the risk that we're holding by underinvesting in renewals versus the amount of time it might take to get to a new investment level.
Sure. So, there's almost any scenario you could imagine we could do. I guess what we've done at the moment is tried to take a sort of a balanced approach. So the one that we have recommended in the or put to you in the schedule is one that we think gets sort of a balance between the risk, the additional risk you take from delay versus try to be affordable. I guess a couple of things to sort of think about as part of that. Certainly trying to work out how we could ramp up our renewals of our roading assets. So that's been quite a thing that we've had to do. So look, we could look at lots of different other scenarios, and I guess I'm saying that's the balance that we've come to at the moment, that we think that puts it as far as we were sort of comfortable to push at this point.
Thanks. I guess to follow up on that, if we were to ask, say, for a 5-year ramp instead of a 3-year ramp to the 40 million level, would you be able to bring us some analysis around potential unintended consequences or risks that we might create by slowing the ramp, as well as some of the advantages in terms of the slower rate impact?
Yes, we could. So we've been trying to prepare some information around the risks associated with effectively the ramp up that we have done now. So we could do that work. I guess at the end of the day, it's really hard to quantify some of this stuff. So we're saying, well, look, on a optimized basis, we would do the renewals on this basis. We can say more. You can't be definitive about what exactly is going to happen. We can make some estimates about the sort of risks that we're taking on. The other thing to, of course, be aware of is that if you push these things out too much, like we've seen in roading, we get a bounce in maintenance. So I think you start getting to the point, if we start pushing it out that far, that I think maybe we would end up seen a lot more unintended consequences around our maintenance budgets than we would gain from the delay in that, which is, again, that's money effectively flushed down the toilet.
Thank you, I think. Finally, at least at this stage, a couple of things that were raised for me through Councillor Johnson's line of questioning around the IFF levy. So who actually makes, if there was a decision, let's say, to target a levy partially towards those that are enjoying the benefits of the growth more than the wider city, who actually makes that decision around what the targeting and differentials are?
That I believe is a council decision. So what will happen is the IFF comes through the council as a proposal, and the council can help. The council determines who's going to ultimately pay for that.
Okay,
yeah,
that's great. And you spoke about an affordability test that's run. Are there other tests that Crown Infrastructure runs?
No, it's primarily around affordability. I think the thing that they will also look at, particularly thinking of some of the growth things, will be the certainty of it being repaid. So that's something they will look at. In terms of the affordability test might look different to what we would apply the affordability test. I believe there is a percentage of income that the housing minister has applied for other areas. So based on Stats New Zealand.
Thank you. And in terms of with rates, if there's non-payment, we have quite strong legal recourse. Do we have that same strength of legal recourse to compel repayment of a levy?
My understanding, and it's an understanding as opposed to 100% certainty, my understanding is that that would be something that CIP would then manage in terms of if people weren't paying. I believe they manage that through some mechanisms that they have to ensure that payments made.
So in terms of then any prospect around, and I'm sorry, I forget the exact words for it, but currently we have kind of a leniency scheme that we operate for some ratepayers that get into difficulty. Is there an ability for the council to be an intermediary in that way if it's a levy, or does it simply hit the ratepayer regardless?
That would be something I would have to come back to you on. Haven't quite gone to that level of detail of administration.
No, that's all right. And just finally, and this probably comes to you, David, we heard your advice around all growth going into an IFF potentially posing some risks in the near term. If we were to take a chronological approach to that rather than a kind of subdivision approach and say from year X, it might be 5 or 6 that growth goes in, would that be something that might moderate some of that risk so that we wouldn't have to put the closed sign up, but we could absorb a little bit more of the debt into an IFF mechanism?
Yeah, it could. I guess the challenge with growth is and as we've seen over the last few years, it can be quite fluid as and when those developments are advanced, because we are heavily reliant on the wills of private landowners as to when they choose to develop or not develop. It's not a case that we set a growth program and then they flick through the LTP and then make their decisions about when they're going to develop or not based on that. It's sort of the other way around, really. So if you did that, and then, for instance, someone wanted to start a bit earlier in an area, which would be a good thing from a land supply perspective, then would be hamstrung in terms of being able to come in and support that. So I think on balance, my advice would be to keep those areas that are zoned or about to be zoned as council funded.
Thanks. I guess just thinking that through a little bit in terms of we've talked about some of the value of headroom. If there was some headroom actually preserved, say we're somewhere between 250 and 280 when we get through this, would that headroom potentially be able to be tapped to address those kind of unexpected potentials like you described?
Yeah, potentially, and I guess the decision the council would have to reach then is whether they're prepared for the headroom to be sort of earmarked, for want of a better term, for growth versus the benefits of it being earmarked for a cyclone or anything else that it might get used for.
Yeah. Thanks. I'll probably pause there, Mr. Mayor. I do have a few others, obviously, but I've had a fair go, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Just one from me. Modelling on revenue, because there's a lot of cost in here, have the transport, I mean, there's a lot of transport stuff there. Are we assuming we get NZTA FAR funding on all of them or some of them, or do we need to go through line by line and just ask those questions?
Yeah, I believe it's on all of them. I think we've got the FAR funding on all the projects.
Okay, well, all right, thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I've got a few questions here. I'll just start with the ones from the presentation. Sorry. The renewals. Oh, so on page 11 of our papers, it talks about the costs alone for the renewals in 3.4, in 3.5, it talks about a 5.8% rates increase just from the Mark 1 renewal budgets. That was for a further 7 million. And so I'm wondering, with the Mark 2 budget, where you've slowed that a little bit, what's the outcome of that in terms of how much rates increase that would require just for the renewal component?
I'm looking to my colleagues over to the side there. I believe it's 2 million. Is that right? I'm getting nods. Yes.
2 million less than 7, so 5, you mean? Or 2
No,
million?
2 million, I believe, is what 2 million is the increase versus the 7 million. So it's gone from 7 million to 2 million.
So if it's 2 million, what's the percentage rates increase? Is that just like one?
It'll be about 1.1. No, it'll be between about 1.6 and 1.8ish. I would think off the top of head.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So, So my second question relates to the assumption around nature calls being funded through an IFF. Is there any risk around that not being funded by through an IFF?
In terms of what the IFF is designed to fund, this sort of project fits well within it. The risk will be around the affordability of the levy, which needs to be further teased out in terms of the next piece of the program for the IFF. And in part, that'll be affordability that the council would deem in terms of an affordable levy, as well as what CIP might deem as affordable. So there's that test that still has to be done.
So are you saying there's no chance that if we raised our debt limit to 250, used that capacity, assuming that the nature calls is not needed, not included, there's no risk that then they would come back and say, no, that does have to be included on our books?
No, I think the risk would be around the total cost of the program in relation to the levy that it would then generate. That would be the risk.
So we're pretty much 100% certain that we can use an IFF to fund that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. The growth programs, going from Mark 1 to Mark 2 through the slowing that's been outlined here, if we were to want to slow it further, where would be the logical next option of how we could do that?
Probably pretty limited, to be honest. So we've gone from 411 million in Mark 1 to 308 million in Mark 2. And then half of that 308 million is assumed to be funded through the IFF, largely for Kakatangiata, Ashurst and the later parts of the industrial park. So it kind of relates a little bit to the answers to the earlier questions, is that if you were to, the balance of the growth programs that are left, the 154, are intended to service land that's already zoned or about to be zoned. So the fact that it's already zoned or it's about to be zoned, the sort of, it's very hard to turn around council's commitment to supporting growth in those locations, because they're what we call plan enabled. So a developer could turn up tomorrow and start to develop in those areas. So if you were to slow them further, you'd effectively be removing the ability to support a developer to start in a location that's already zoned.
Okay, so even with the Mark II funding being 308 million, that seems to be like more than double what we had in the last LTP. What's essentially changed other than, is it more than twice the price now, or are we just trying to do more growth areas at a faster rate?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair question, and I think the answer to that is a number of factors. You know, we, as Chris touched on, infrastructure is more expensive. We also have a much better understanding, and you know, we talked earlier in the slides about increasing standards and expectations around the outcomes that we're seeking in our growth areas. So if you look at the quality of the urban form outcomes that we're seeking, for instance, in Kakatangiata and Te Utanganui and Akotiri, so you know, stormwater expectations around sponge cities, that all requires purchasing land, setting aside areas for low impact stormwater. So it's a little bit like you know, the drivers for Nature Calls going from 200 or 300 million to 600 million. The standards and expectations that we're working to have increased. Some of those are government driven, some of them are our own aspirations about how we want growth to happen, and we have a much better understanding of that now. So we've got detailed structure plans. And land purchases, you know, you'll be aware, as a practical real life example, you know, in the last year or so, we ended up buying some land at Whakaronga for stormwater. I think that was $6 million. The budget was well less than that. So there's a real life example of the budget in the current LTP, a real life example of the cost of infrastructure in growth areas compared to what we've maybe historically budgeted.
Okay, thank you. Just my next question relates to the chart on page 19, table 4, with the summary of sort of where we're at. I'm presuming, well, it says that that's the position based on recommended use of levers. So I assumed that those are the numbers after the levers. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, so these, I guess these are the numbers that have come out of Mark II, where we have pulled on some of those levers that we talked about in the workshop on the 3rd of November.
Okay, so the growth one that you just mentioned, David, is still at 308. So is that assuming that we're not putting half of it in an IFF?
Sorry, maybe I'll try and answer that. That's the growth total is still 308, but what we are, I guess, what we are seeking is, I guess, your approval to use, I think it was 154 million to go and be funded from the IFF. So I don't, I'd have to check with you. The current state has that included. I don't think it does, but I could be. I'll check with you on that. I think we were seeking your advice first before we actually made that change, but I'll just check.
Okay.
Sorry, actually, one thing that's just jumped into my mind about my earlier answer to your question, Councillor Naylor, is in terms of the 154 and maybe the ability to reduce some of that. One possibility is there's about $40 million of transport programs for Akotiri. at the moment, the plan change, district plan change for Aokautere, there's a hearing next week where the timing of those growth programs will be discussed as part of that, and we'll start to get an indication. There's some evidence emerging that there may be an ability to delay some of those, so they weren't required as early as possible. But until that hearing is held, and we sort of, I think the decision will be some time off, but I suspect during the course of the hearing we may well get an indication about whether or not those transport upgrades are. At the moment, the rezoning is predicated on the basis that they're required before any more development can happen, and that's being tested. So that might mean there's about $40 million that could potentially be deferred, but we'll know more in the next 2 weeks.
And sorry, just to clarify, note that we have assumed the IFF at this point in time. That table is just highlighting the total amount of the expenditure in the budget as opposed to how it's funded. So of 308, we have already assumed at the moment that we'd use 154 out of IFF.
Okay, so if we use IFF for half of the growth, or around half of the growth, do we still have to include that for our calculations for our debt level, maximum debt level?
You still need to show capital expenditure that you're intending to spend. We would then just fund half of it through debt and half of it through IFF, which is what we're currently got in our model.
So based on that, why are we not showing the Nature Calls debt that's funded through IFF in there then?
It is included in the grand total of the 2.4 billion. Actually does include Nature Calls. It's just that it's not separately identified because it's in the, I believe it's in the legal requirement category.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, thank you. And just coming back to the presentation, page 9, the 20 million of loan-funded capital program equates to a total rates of increase of 1%. Following on from the Mayor's question around the Waka Kotahi revenue, do we know overall what our revenue assumptions are for all of our capital programs that offset? So if we're looking at 2.4 billion on that table 4, do we know how much revenue we're assuming offsets that to determine how much needs to be debt funded?
Yes, so on page 8 of the presentation, it does show the funding in that graph that we have applied so far. So the grey shaded parts of the bars are the Waka Kotahi funded capital program.
Okay. Does someone know how much that adds up to over the 10 years?
Yes, I can find that out for you and get it to you.
Thank you. Just because that I guess gives I guess there's another way of asking this. I mean, because when I look at, that's 100%, $2 billion worth of capital program equates to 100% rates increase based on that calculation. So I'm assuming that we take the revenues off before we do that calculation. Is that correct?
Yes.
So where is this looking, based on our Mark II budget, how over 10 years, what's the percent rates increase required to fund this amount of capital program?
At the moment, so I guess it really depends on some of the decisions that you're going to make around where your debt limits are and I guess what programs are in and out. What I can tell you is that if you were to hit your debt limit of 250%, because I don't have the other detail in front of me, I think from memory we were looking at somewhere around the 45 odd million of interest in year 10 if we'd hit that at that point. At the moment we pay about 12 million. Yeah.
Thank you. I did receive that via email, the interest. What I was interested in, so on page 9 of the presentation, it talked about every 20 million of loan funded capital programs increases total rates by 1%. And so I worked out 2 billion would be 100% rates increase over 10 years. But that's why I was asking about the revenue. Have we got an assumption about how much rates increase is required for this level of capital programs once we've offset the revenue assumption?
Yes, I'd have to find out the specific detail on the debt portion, but when we've worked out the debt headroom or the debt limit line, we're assuming at the moment that red line that you've seen that goes across the previous graph, we've got an assumption at the moment, past year one, I think it's 7% per annum increase in total revenue, of which a portion of that will be rates and other revenues. I'd have to come to you specifically on what the actual total cumulative debt changes. I can answer you around how much is funded from Waka Kotahi and other revenues out of the total program, and that's 200 million at the moment.
200 million from
Yep.
Waka Kotahi.
And then I think there's about 800 million from IFF assumed at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I'm nearly there, sorry. Just my other question relates to that table 4. It says it's based on the recommended use of levers. Now, one of the levers was changes to fees and charges. Which page was that on? 11, I think, or 13. Oh, yeah. The levers here down towards the bottom of page 13, increase fees and charges. What level of consideration has gone into the use of that lever? Has that lever been applied to the Mark II budget in any way?
We are still looking at that particular lever, and why I say that is the lever is going to have the effect on the operating budget than it will on the capital budget. So we're still working through the finer, I guess, details of the operating budget at the moment.
Apart from development contributions, perhaps? Or is that counted as a separate?
We are doing some work around development contributions now. In terms of how the development contributions impact on debt room, the issue with development contributions is that we receive them sometime in the past, often after we've done the development, so we still actually have to take out the loans initially. So you need to have the capacity to take the loan out to do the infrastructure before you collect back in the development contribution.
Okay, I think that'll be all from me for now. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Look, just on some of the questions that Naila had around modelling the revenue, could I ask you, Cam, and I think we had a discussion about it offline, if we could have some idea of the transparency of all of that? Because we've got, quite a bit of NZTA funding there, obviously rates with general and targeted, fees and charges, DCs, there's royalties from the likes of Mercury, there's trade waste fees, I understand, are we still getting a small petrol tax or a bit of revenue from that? Yeah. Other external government funds, obviously, what the commercial team's doing around external funding from trusts, other city partners. So could I get some idea of what that is, please?
Yep, we can go away and provide that for you in a breakdown so that you can see what our revenue assumptions will be and what's making that up.
Yeah, great, appreciate it. Councillor Hancock.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the presentation and copious quantities of information that we've got to digest. I've only got a few questions really now because other councillors have actually asked some questions which had interested me. The first one really is just in relation to development contributions, and you guys have actually already talked about, sometimes it's 20 to 30 years before we actually recoup that money from the developers. Is there anything that can be done to actually speed that process up? Because it seems a little bit unfair that we carry the debt and the liability for that until such time as they've decided that it's time to pay us.
The short answer is no, but unfortunately, but to provide just a little bit more context. So we're responsible for providing like network infrastructure, so that the bulk infrastructure to an area that will typically benefit. In some cases it might benefit 5 or 6 different developers or 5 or 6 different subdivisions, but it's provided a new bore to the east of the city, to the west, and and under the legislation, the times at which we can collect the development contributions is either building consent, service connection, or subdivision. So subdivision is typically the first stage of development, and the policy is very clear that we want to recover our contributions at the earliest stage possible, which is subdivision. But beyond that, we don't have a mechanism within the legislation to seek it earlier. So unfortunately, if you put a bore down and it services an area for 30 years, until and if it's, as I said, if it's 4 or 5 different developers or subdivisions, that until the last subdivision or the last stage of the last subdivision is when you'll collect your return on that asset. So it's probably poorly, I guess, an issue that's poorly understood by parts of the community, the development community, just how much the council sort of front foots development.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess over time, that's the value of the DC actually diminishes as time goes on. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, what we do is the historical cost of infrastructure. So if we put in a bore today and it costs $1, but we update the development contributions every 3 years, that the bore that costs $1 in 3, 6, 9, 12 years is adjusted, so the developers are paying the cost of putting that infrastructure in that later on. So we don't, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And just in terms of the what we actually charge for our DCs, I see that we're around about 12K per section. Other councils are 25 to 80K per section. Are we at the moment thinking about what we might do in that space?
Yes, we're doing some scenarios at the moment to look at some amendments to the policy with sort of 2 drivers in mind. One is to look at how the residential developers, or the residential fees, can increase proportionately to the non-residential, because as we've had a couple of chats in the chamber over the last few months about the non-residential developments where we're competing nationally for inward investment, whereas the residential development not so much. So we're looking at how we can, within the methodology of the policy, shift some of that cost to residential development from non-residential, but also looking at a more equitable mechanism for charging non-residential, because we have, in some cases, very large sheds, dry sheds with a small amount of water being triggering a large DC. So we're looking at that as well, and that will come back. We're doing some scenarios at the moment that will come back with the recommended policy early next year.
Great, thank you. And if I can just switch to the IFF special purpose funding, just a really sort of final question on that, and just around affordability and the assumption that that money would be available to us. Have we done any more, like for example with Nature Calls, we'd probably be looking at the majority of our ratepayers would actually pay into that for the $647 million that at the moment that's the cost for Nature Calls. So have we not done any modelling at all in terms of what that levy might be per household?
Again, it comes to, the difficulty with it depends on the differentials that you might apply to different property types. So that makes it quite tricky to sort of say, well, this is definitively what a household might pay versus what a business might pay. We haven't done that level of change, but I think if and also these numbers have been updated to reflect the latest position for this long-term plan. But I guess on the previous numbers, I think a really basic back of envelope calculation could have been up around that $900 mark. So it's quite hefty. It's quite a sizable, I guess, piece of infrastructure that has to be funded, and we would be doing the same affordability test for ourselves if we were funding it ourselves as what we would have to do if the IFF are funding it. So that piece of work we will need to be doing when we sharpen that pencil a bit more.
Yeah, I guess, like we've got an assumption that this entire long-term plan really is predicated on being able to actually access the IFF funding. And of course, if we fail the affordability test right at the start gate, what are the implications for all the things that we're going to consider over the next month, 2 months?
The issue around affordability for that particular program, the first stake in the ground is that the council itself does not have the debt capacity to be able to afford that program. So that's I guess the first point. Then I guess there is an ability to fund it through the IFF, because that's what that scheme is there for. Council will need to make some decisions around whether the levy at the end of the day, and therefore the cost and scope of that project is correct, and therefore the levy it generates is wants community to then have to pay, and who pays what share of it. So there's a fair bit of detail in that aspect that still has to be worked through. That would be what would the 12 to 18 month process would take us through that journey.
Okay, and probably just a final wash-up question on the, oh, sorry, Chris.
It's just sort of the other thing to add, Councillor, is at the moment the numbers that we've got in the long-term plan for the BPO are very, very sort of high-level numbers, so we can't put a lot of stock in them. And I think as we get through that process, as we get through the consenting process and we firm up on exactly those things, then we'll be in a position to do a lot more detailed work around final design and working out how we can build it in an affordable way. So I guess at this point as well, we've got it in there and it's a bit of an unknown number. For me, it looks far too big compared to what we probably want to do. But because of the assumption we're making, it sort of nets off. It doesn't affect our decisions. But look, I would think that by the time this process is finished, we've looked really, really closely at that and found an affordable way of delivering it, because of the issues we're talking about in terms of affordability. We can only build it if it's affordable. So it's it's a bit black and white, and it's a bit sort of circular. So ultimately, the reason we're comfortable with it, because the only way it can work is if it ultimately becomes affordable.
Yeah, okay.
If that makes sense.
A couple more questions, if I may. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. And just to tidy up the IFF conversation, is that council actually raises that debt under council's name, so therefore we are responsible for that debt?
No. It is raised under a special purpose vehicle through Crown Infrastructure Partners. Right. So they raise the debt under their name on our behalf to fund our infrastructure. But then it is funded from the levy, which is a commitment back to CIP, so from the person paying the levy.
Okay, thank you. But default on that debt, what happens there?
I think that, similar to the question that Councillor answered earlier, there's a bit of more detail. We need to just understand what happens in those scenarios. But my understanding is, my current understanding is that the Crown Infrastructure Partners are responsible for ultimately responsible for collecting the levy.
Thank you. And just the last question, just in terms of the capital renewals, just a bit of clarity there, just in terms of actually slowing that down. The paper actually refers to the risk around urgent repair costs. So when we're actually doing our LTP, are we actually building in some contingency funding into what's actually in front of us at the moment, or is there nothing? Do we just carry that risk?
So in terms of, like, if we think about a individual renewals program, for instance, we've put a number in there. So that number is, it's our estimate of what it would cost, but that would include some, in terms of the number, they're usually pretty high level, but they would include a contingency factor in terms of those estimates.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Mayor, thanks.
I suppose I should just add too that under any sort of city deal, we'll be trying to seek some sort of government share on this, as well as, and there has been some precedent set with other smaller councils where there has been a government share to waters and wastewater plants, but also any other trade partners as well. And there's a very real possibility that could happen as well. So it may not end up being all IFF funded by levies to the ratepayers. Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, we'll do one more. Councillor Zabellin, hopefully it's not a great big long list.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I do want to ask about the levy though, and particularly, it's my understanding that special purpose vehicle could be responsible for raising or collecting the funds and raising finance, but also could be responsible for delivering the infrastructure. Is that correct?
I suppose there's a number of ways of doing it, but under the IFF legislation, I think it's specifically dealing with the funding element of it. So basically, you know, the way I understand kind of the structured partner work, so they've got some international funders that they've, you know, lined up to potentially provide the debt when a project comes along, and it gets to the point where it's, you know, as Cam said, you know what your costs are going to be, then they'll go to market and finalise the deal around that. Again, that'll take into account sort of risks in delivery and all of that sort of carry on. So they pass the money over to council, so they lend us the money and we use that to deliver the project. I guess you could put it together with a wider deal, so you could have a project partner to do the delivery as well. So you could put those together, but I suspect they would be separate vehicles in terms of one around the funding and one around the delivery.
Right, okay. So I've picked that out of the paper that we had to council a few months ago looking at what different vehicles we've got, and it does talk there about SPCV could deliver the infrastructure or just collect the funding or raise the financing. I guess what I'm interested in is if we are delivering the infrastructure, we then collect the levy, transfer it on to the special purpose vehicle, which then pays us to deliver the infrastructure?
Yeah, so think about it as just getting like the special purpose vehicle, like your bank, who's you're getting debt from. So then, but the different thing is that, you know, you're not having to pay them back. So you get the money from them, but what they get out of it is is basically a right to the levies ongoing, which is, you know, same as effectively like a rate. Yeah. So look around. There are in terms of a special purpose vehicle for delivering the infrastructure. So that could be a design, build, operate. You know, so there's lots of different vehicles that you could have for the actual infrastructure itself. So we could actually go into an arrangement where we pay for it on an operating lease or some sort of operating cost. That could be, you know, some of the ones that you have are sort of a PPP would include funding with it. The specific IFF one is, you know, that's specifically around the funding element, but there's nothing stopping us doing some sort of bigger thing that would deal with the delivery of the project and potentially the ownership of the asset as well.
And so then if we were fronting the delivery of that and we were receiving payments from the SPV to pay that, does that count as revenue on our books?
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, we're just a mechanism for collecting the levy. The levy goes straight to the special purpose vehicle, if you know what I mean.
But yes, but if we are then delivering the infrastructure, though the funding mechanism is different, at some point we would have to receive funds to be able to pay for that to go ahead. So that's what I'm kind of asking is where does, if that comes through from them to us to then deliver the asset, that's revenue, but it's not really revenue.
Right, so just on the mechanics a little bit, is we are effectively an agent. So the levy will show up on the rates bill, collect the money passes off to the SPV to repay the loan. But at the start, what it will show is that we will show an external funding source from the SPV to fund the project. So you'll get a big bulk. You know, at the moment, which we would typically show it as a loan, but in this case, it'll come through as a grant or external source of funding to pay for the piece of infrastructure. When it gets repaid, whilst the levy sits on the rates invoice, and specified as the levy. It's collected by us, goes straight to the SPV, and does not show on our books as our money in any way coming back that way.
Okay, thank you. And finally, my other question on that is comparative costs to other funds that have been raised by other councils through this levy. I think there was an example of Tauranga raising 175 million for 13 different transport projects. And I'm wondering whether our figure's quite a bit bigger than that. Are there other comparative or comparatively priced projects that have had the bulk of their funding raised through a levy like this?
So Wellington City for their Moa Point sludge facility, and I think they raised somewhere in the vicinity of $350 to $400 million. I guess the comparison of the debt, the interest rate that the SPV can get debt for to our LGFA rate will depend on the market at the time they go out to raise it, but they do have a wide number of financial institutions that they put ultimately the funding proposal to secure a pretty good deal. It's admittedly the LGFA is as close to the government borrowing rate as you can get, so that's always going to be a really good source of funding for a council. But it has its limitations into how much council itself can raise through it.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so that's probably about half the amount we'd be seeking to raise is the largest comparative example we could think of, off the top of our heads.
They raised over 400.
400.
Yeah.
And that's all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Great. Right, thank you. Look, we're going to break for a cup of tea. So we'll be back in the chamber at 1:15. I'm just going to signal to councillors there's quite a bit on this evening as well. So we're going to adjourn this meeting at 4:15, and then obviously we'll resume on Friday at 10 o'clock. So just to give you a heads up. Thank you. Kia ora tātou, welcome back everybody. If we can have our main actors back at the table, please. And perhaps Cam, if I could just ask you, because there's been a number of questions around the IFF and how that is going to possibly be constructed, could I just get you to do a one-pager and send that out to all? I'm loading you up with a few things.
Yeah, we can do that, and there is actually some material out there that the other councils have pulled together, so we'll just try and piggyback off what's
Great.
already exists.
I think it'll just help all elected members understand how it works, and maybe a couple of examples, i.e. the Taurongas and Wellingtons and how they've done that. Excellent. Right, we'll go through other councillors. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. So just focusing on renewals, since that's what's up first. If council took a view that the sum total of renewals over the 10 years was too high, what's your advice on how we could or should reduce it? And I'm hearing you saying, oh, well, there'll be impact in terms of increased maintenance and unexpected failures. I'm hearing that, but so you don't need to repeat that bit. But just how is the best way to go about reducing the cost of these renewals? Is it better for us to say to you, we'd like to see it around X? Can you bring that back? Is it better for us to attempt a sort of line-by-line approach? What's your advice? Because I'm feeling myself that renewals needs to come down.
Or a bit of everything.
Well, it could be all of that. I mean, and I'm not just picking on renewals, but renewals is up, so...
Yep, I agree.
So before we start putting stuff up, I'd appreciate advice on what you think the most effective approach to this could be. Understanding that you don't want us to reduce renewals.
Yep. No, I get that. But look, at the end of the day, as David said before, I mean, it's your plan. And, I suppose, I think the best thing we can do is to give you the sort of the basic information on, what renewals we're proposing and what we think that the risks are around it. And I know that you've heard that. But at the end of the day, it sort of comes back to, I guess, your sort of risk tolerance and your tolerance to effectively reducing service levels. So because that is the consequence of it. So that so if you decided you were prepared to take a higher risk, then we could sort of do it either way. We could say, well, look, if you're prepared to take a high level of risk, then we can stretch it out even further. Again, just to be transparent about what the issues are.
Perhaps I'll just try and help here as well. So from Mark 1 down to Mark 2 was the decisions that we made as a team was to effectively do what you're suggesting, which was put in a dollar amount and then look to reduce from the Mark 1 budget down to Mark 2. So as an option, what you could do is you could say, well, we want our renewals budget to look like this, and then you trust us to go away and then prioritise the renewal budget on where we think that the best, where the money needs to go. And I think that what you've already heard is transport needs a bit of a kick upwards in order to get that contract and other things around that in place. That's one option that you could consider, is just say, here's the dollar amount across the 10-year program for renewals. Keen for you to increase that over the course of 3 to 5 years, is what I think I've been hearing, and put and have a value across the 10-year program as an option.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know we're not at this yet, but of course, any decisions we make now potentially impacts this one when it comes up. So, given that your advice is that of the of the 526 million, is it, strategic projects over the 10 years, that we can only afford to do 100 million of them. if we were minded to do more than 100 million of strategic projects, what is your advice on how we would make room for those in the budget?
Again, I'll have a bit of a stab at this one to start off with as well. I mean, the options you have in front of you is that any reduction that you might make in schedules 1, 2 and 3 potentially provide some headroom for you in those options or those projects that are in number 4. Also come back to perhaps some of the earlier commentary as well about other funding, and I think Councillor Barrett asked some good questions about are there opportunities for us to think about funding some of our programs in a different way and partnering up. And I think that you've probably heard me talk about that several times in the chamber as well, about thinking about different ways of being able to fund the Forward Works program that we do have in front of us. And hence you're starting to see some options about IFF funding or whatever it might be for growth for the Nature Calls project. But there's other ways of thinking about building infrastructure where we don't necessarily need to be the owners of it, but potentially look to lease or those sorts of things in the future as well. So there might be a number of projects that you go through there. I think a couple of the other ones that are already in there that do have some other funding attached to it. Te Mautoa Poutoa has council money in there, but is also funding coming from Rangatane and potentially some other sources as well. So there's already some examples in there where you could ask us to stretch that a little bit further. That will require us to have some time and space to do that, which might mean that year 1 is where you're giving us time and space to investigate some of those things further for doing things in years 2, 3, 4 and beyond, if that helps.
Okay, so just to clarify what I've heard is that we would need to reduce what we've got in appendices 1, 2 and 3. There's no other option.
Can I just make one clarification? So the clarification is that by reducing the renewals, that does not increase the debt capacity to fund Schedule 4 because renewals is funded off the rates, whereas it's the other categories that are funded off loans. So just want to clarify that.
Yeah, but the renewals is what's contributing to a bigger rate increase, isn't it?
Yes, so renewals will drive some of the rates increase.
Yeah. No, I'm aware of that. Thank you. So, in terms of schedules 1, 2, 3, and 4, then reducing Schedule 1 won't have any effect on the debt headroom. Then is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So basically, it's Schedules 2 and 3 that would have to reduce if we wanted to have more options for including programs from Schedule 4.
Yes.
And the concept of increasing the debt ceiling to 280 you advise against?
Yes.
Okay. I'm loving the concise answers, Cam. I'm here for it. Thank you.
Great. Chris, just quickly, and I know we've just talked about this before, but that all those transport figures you've said include the NZTA co-funding. So that's roads, pathways, footpaths, PT, active, and the bus terminal.
Yes, I believe they would all attract co-funding.
So where is that shown? Again, like this comes down to this revenue, because obviously we won't be needing it's not all rates funded, right? So there'll be a dollar which will be signalled as NZTA, and as the CE said, possibly a small amount that's external as well from other sources. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, understand the question. So things that are transport related, we've applied Waka Kotahi funding to all of it.
Yeah.
It's not apparently visible in the schedules. We can go away and see how we could provide that and mail it out just so you've got it. It's one of those ones that the real estate actually makes it quite difficult to show.
Yeah, I'm hearing you, and I do understand the challenges you have there. It's just if members come back and say they want to change the recommendation, they start putting some dollar values around things, then we just need to know when there's no unforeseen consequences.
So what we could do, and what we can do is, I think we could come up with a schedule of what is externally funded and what is the total amount across the 10 years that's coming
From rates.
from those external funded
Okay.
pieces.
All right, cool. Councillor
Just-
Brown.
Sorry, just one clarification of courses, because one thing that is very frustrating is the misalignment between the timing around the LTP and the timing around our application with Waikotahi funding as well. So we've put in at the moment effectively our Mark 1 budget to them and saying this is what we've done. You know, unfortunately, we won't be 100% certain until later in terms of what they're prepared to fund. And then ultimately, in terms of what lands up in the LTP is what we then go back and, you know, clarify. Makes them very frustrated, but it's also difficult. But unfortunately, we've got to work to their timeframe, not ours.
Yeah. No, I understand, but thank you for the answer. Over to you, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks all for this. Just following up on the question that Councillor Barrett asked about how best to reflect external funding opportunities into this. What I'm hearing is that that's our intention, to go and find money from whichever tree we can shake. Is that an assumption that needs to be captured in these recommendations? Because it isn't at the moment. We talk about IFFs and nothing else.
From my perspective, and the CE may want to jump in, my perspective, it would be useful to have an understanding from elected members what projects that you would see that you would like to proceed on the basis that we would be getting external funding. Because remembering, if we don't get it, then essentially what that is saying is that the project won't proceed without a further change in decision from what the LTP says in that assumption.
I think I'd probably reflect that back at you and say we would probably like to hear from you which projects you think we would be capable of attracting external funding to in order to inform that decision, because things I think are fundable, that might not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, we can provide some advice around what we think is potential, but I think if I was thinking in a generic sense to give some guidance, would be things where typically we might have in there to build something, for argument's sake, that's a building or what have you. They're the types of things that perhaps we could attract a property development partner or what have you. So it's those sorts of things. Taking the Tauranga example, we may want to make an assumption that there's a private-public partnership around something like the Ring Road, for argument's sake, because that's of sufficient scale and could potentially have a charging mechanism that would suit a private partner.
I'm hearing there are lots of opportunities. I think my question is, does that need to be captured as an assumption, or is that something that we can just assume without assumption?
We can bring it back that here are some further opportunities.
Good. And then my other question, leaving aside anything to do with special purpose vehicles, was about how we structure our debt. So in 4.2, where we talk about increasing the debt limit, we start from that premise of funding our debt. And my understanding has always been over the life of the asset or 30 years, whichever is shorter. Would there be any benefit to council in looking at how we structure that debt typically? Like going longer than 30 years is what I'm thinking.
30 years, I believe, is a prudent length of time. The challenge with extending that time horizon, and admittedly we do build some infrastructure that has a life longer than 30 years, so taking that on board. But the challenge with that is actually you start to get to a point where you're paying a large amount of interest. Say you extended it to say 50 years, there's a lot of extra interest from years 30 to 50 that has to be paid. The other disadvantage to it is when you're approaching the debt capacity limit, the slower that you pay the debt down, the less additional capacity you create in effect. So, so it actually can inhibit you in future decision making from taking longer to pay the debt off.
So what I'm hearing you say is that we're comfortable at 30 years is pragmatic. It doesn't totally give effect to our strategic driver of intergenerational location of assets, but it pragmatically works with the way the debt needs to be paid back.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
And Cam, IFF now accept 50-year timelines, I understand?
They were investigating it. I'm not sure if they have landed at that time horizon yet.
Okay, because that's quite critical for us. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple follow-ups at this point. I think the ones around the language in recommendation 1G, which talks about identifying one of those IFFs, and there's another recommendation further on. If we were to adopt those, now, would that preclude us amending that as we work through the appendices if a view developed that we should be pushing other expenditure into those vehicles?
I don't believe it would limit you to looking at other opportunities. It's just making a call that for those ones already identified would apply that assumption. It doesn't stop you from potentially looking at other opportunities.
Thank you. The one pager that you're preparing for the mayor on IFFs, will it include some advice around scope in terms of both the potential to expand the nature calls towards a more generic waters as well as the growth towards a more generic green growth? Noting that we've already heard some of the weaknesses and concerns around those options.
It really, that's quite difficult to do because it's just how broad do you make that? And I think what that one pager would do for you though is it would give you an understanding of how the IFF works and whether you would decide to broaden it or not in terms of its use. The same principles of what that one page I'm thinking in my head I'd provide could be applied. But
great, thank you, appreciate that. Can I just understand the councils that are, this is kind of around the debt cap, councils that are already at the 280, if they need to go borrow just one more dollar, like is there literally nobody that will lend them the dollar, or is it they have to go to somewhere besides LGFA and pay a higher cost for that dollar?
There's again, I can give a bit of a broad answer to it. So the 280% is an LGFA covenant. That doesn't mean to say that some of these entities might get some borrowing from elsewhere, but remembering that they'll be at higher rates. The other thing too, this if they can get it. The other thing as well is we're a credit rated council and it will have impacts on the credit rating that council receives, which then impacts on the interest rates that we then
and where does the credit rating kick in? Is that at 280 or is that?
Credit rating is assessed more so on the view of council's credit worthiness and ability to pay back its debt and meeting the covenants and various things that are required upon us.
So there's no firm number on that then? It's more of an overall assessment?
It's an overall assessment.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great,
it takes
thanks.
into all sorts of different contexts.
Your advice around 250 is distinct from, I guess, 249 or 251 for argument's sake. Like, how important are in your view, how important is 250 as opposed to something there and thereabouts?
Again, it is an elected member decision ultimately where you land, but I think having a minimum of that 30% buffer gives you an opportunity if unforeseen things occur. So I'd see 250 as a maximum as opposed to you could decide if it's something lower, but obviously it's going to impact on what you can afford to do with the size of the capital program.
Thank you. And finally, this might be something that comes back in the explainer as well, but I'm trying to get my head around co-funding as it potentially applies to debt caps. And so, for instance, if Waka Kotahi co-funds something, or if another third party co-funds something, are there potential scenarios where it does end up landing on our books as debt and hits our cap instead of their cap? It would just be useful to have that clarified in the next tranche of information.
So might just get you to clarify the question so I understand, but in terms of the debt cap, our debt limit, only our portion is reflected in there. Because we show the other side of the funding, which is the co-funding coming in. If the co-funding doesn't exist, what we are suggesting would be then we would have to revisit the decision of whether we do the thing, or do or then determine whether we would borrow additionally.
And that's regardless of whether the co-funding comes from government, private sector, philanthropy, whatever.
Correct. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions from me on the renewals and a few program line items. Just coming back to the page 15 of the presentation, just trying to get my head around how come we only need an extra 2 million for renewals based on the Mark II budget. What's our current rolling 3-year average for funding renewals?
I'm looking to my colleagues over there, but I think we're around about the 27 million mark.
Yeah.
27.7.
Okay, so how come we only need another 2 million? Because the average of year 1, 2 and 3 on the Mark II budget is 35.9.
There's a number of the areas where the increase in renewals are in transport, which have Waka Kotahi funding.
Okay, so we definitely only need to, because that year 3, the 40 million is quite a big step up if we're currently only funding at 27, did you say 27.7?
Yes, that's where we are at the moment.
Okay. So
Remembering though that so it's a step up for year 1, but in year 2 you'll have another step up to reflect what's coming in the future years. So
is the 3-year rolling average from the year and the next 2 years?
Yes.
It's not, okay,
Yes.
I'm with you now. Okay, so just a few program ones. The first one, program 1242, CET Arena replacement for Arena big screen, 884,000 in year 2. Is there any thinking around, if we were to make that one subject to some external funding, have we ever got external funding for funding renewals before? Is that an okay thing for us to indicate?
You could indicate it, and I guess look to my colleagues whether there's some other advice, but I think because it is a replacement, it's not, funders don't often look at replacements, I guess, as favourably as they do new things.
So what if we said we weren't going to replace it?
That would be, that's your decision that you could make, but I guess the implication beyond the service levels, we could try and obtain funding.
But I'm not suggesting we do. So what I'm trying to say is if we said we weren't going to do it, then could it be a new thing?
I think we would struggle because we already have one.
Okay, so what would be the impact of us pushing that out a couple of years to year 4?
Give a colleague to.
Bryce Hosking, Group Manager of Property and Resource Recovery. This is actually a venues program, not mine, but essentially if it wasn't to be replaced in year 2 and it was deferred, then the asset would stay in its current condition, which it does have some issues at the moment. It has a big line through it. It's not particularly clear and things like that. So essentially, it just wouldn't be functioning to the level of service required.
Okay, thank you.
It's also just through the chair is that Mercury are also contributing some funding towards that piece of work as well, 150K.
Oh, so there is some external funding? Yes. 150, okay, thank you. And is there a time frame around that?
It's there now.
Oh, so what, we've got the money, you mean? Oh, okay. Now, I also wanted to ask about the program just above that, the 1127, which is a shade house and bonsai display. Would there be any impact on pushing that out to years 4 and 5?
Kathy Deaver-Todd, Group Manager, Parks and Logistics. So the engineer's report said that the bonsai house is structurally at the end of its life now. If we delayed it further, you carry an increased risk that the shade house would have to be closed because of safety concerns, but that is that's a bit of a calculated risk. That's the only impact of delaying that project.
Okay, thank you. And just the final question is around council plant and vehicle replacements 1879. Has there been any consideration of different models of vehicle, supply of vehicles for council? Well, is replacement of vehicles the most cost-effective way of?
Yes, it is. So there was an investigation into the management of fleet, an independent investigation about 2 or 3 years ago. That the buying power of council is such that we are best to purchase the vehicles ourselves and get that benefit of buying power and then on-sell them. There's a very good market for second-hand vehicles. Bear in mind, councillors, that some of the vehicles within that program are some of our large trucks, like our refuse and recycling trucks and larger trucks, and they are somewhat different to passenger vehicles. They're critical to the delivery of the essential service.
Okay, thank you. And just the year 2 is a little bit more than the other years. Is there a reason for that? Is that because of the reduced budget this year, or what? Is there a reason for that?
So the program reflects the actual things that we're purchasing in that year. So that year we'll have a purchase of a truck, and a truck does retail out at between 150,000 200,000 for a dump truck.
Okay, thank you. That's all from me.
Councillor Harpiter.
Thank you. I'm on page 19, where it's got legal requirements. Could we put water next to that so it's quite clear that it is about water? And my next question is, it's 867 million. Is that non-negotiable? Was there any movement on that?
I'm not sure if I quite followed that. Could you ask the question?
So it's 867 million.
Yes.
So is there any movement on that, or is that exactly the price?
Yeah, so that's probably what I was talking about earlier when we talked about the BPOs currently sitting around that 600 plus million. Definitely, I think there's movement. So I guess, where it is at the moment is all about getting the consent done. So there's been estimates done around what it would cost to do the plant. But at this stage, they are quite high-level estimates, and it won't be until we get later in the program and getting into some more detailed design and framing up on that, whereas we can have more confidence around the costs. The assumption we've made at the moment is that it would all be paid through an IFF. So while we don't have high confidence, it will net out.
Okay. Just on this table, it's not as clear on the table what things are. So the next line down just says critical. Are you talking about capital projects on that next one down?
Yeah, so they're what we're calling critical capital projects. And this is where we're sort of trying to differentiate them between what's critical and what's strategic. So the critical ones are, like I said, that'd be the duplicate water main from the dam to the treatment plant. You know, we call it critical because if it fails, have an impact on the entire network. Whereas something like safety improvements on an individual road, we put them in strategic because, you know, they're not going to have an impact on that.
So is there a way you could put infrastructure next to it? I mean, I just think there's no transparency around, I mean, for transparency purposes, it'd be...
Gotcha.
Can I just clarify? I mean, they're sort of been categorised and described in these broad categories and spreadsheets attached for the purposes of the conversation today. That's not how they would then be presented in an LTP. It's really about just how we've packaged them together for the most logical conversation today.
It's hard to find them, that's all, and trying to match them up with spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, more questions. Back to this table 4. I guess what I don't understand, given the answer that you gave earlier, Cam, about renewals, is why the cost of renewals is then being included in the total amount of capital. And it was certainly in the total amount of capital when we came to the graphs in the presentation on the debt limits. So is the capital renewals included in the debt limit or not?
No, so the table, what the table is trying to represent is the total cost of the capital program. Renewals is part of the capital program, but if you recall the graph that showed where the debt limit was compared to the different types of or categorisations of programs, renewals wasn't on that graph because it's funded by rates.
Okay, thank you. So then, still looking at table 4, assuming approximately half of the growth is in an IFF and approximately 650 million of the legal requirement, which is nature causes, in an IFF, I still don't understand why it only leaves us 100 million for strategic, when in the last long-term plan, the majority of those strategic projects were in it and costed. We're taking out, effectively, in terms of debt, I know it still has to be paid for, so no one needs to tell me that, but we're taking it out to put it in an IFF. We're taking out 800, more or less 800 million. I just don't understand why we're being told that we can't afford to put all of those projects that are in strategic in the plan. And we're increasing the percentage of borrowing that we can do. So just, I know it's a very basic question, but I just don't understand.
Yeah. Caveated that I wasn't here part of the previous LTP, so hopefully I get this right. But my understanding is the previous LTP council did adopt a long-term plan where the expected debt exceeded its limits by some way, and I know for the most part that was due to the IFF, not the IFF, the nature calls.
Yeah.
Spoken about IFF a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, we have.
What I can tell you is that based on an increase of the debt limit to 250%, it gives you about, I think it's about 500 odd million of headroom of additional debt that you can take out. And so when we're looking at that table, we've got 150 million still left in growth. There's the best part of 300 million left in the new capital type still to be funded even after IFF and other funding. That leaves us 100 million of headroom remaining in our debt position with a 250% debt limit. And so what we're saying at the moment is we can't afford, we don't have the ability within that debt headroom to fit everything in. and we need to make some decisions around whether what we actually leave in the other two categories will actually determine just how much in total we can have.
See, this is where I still, and, you know, perhaps other people do, and if so, I'm sorry for banging on about it, but this is where I just do not understand what we're being told now compared to what we were told 3 years ago. Because all of the changes that we're making, I would have thought would have enabled us to have much more spend than 500 million. But nevertheless, that's what you're saying the limit is. How is it that the 500 million of strategic projects, strategic in inverted commas, because I'll be questioning the categorisation of them, how is it that they were in, for the most part, they're not new projects. I mean, granted there are one or two, but most of them are projects that were in the last long-term plan. How is it that they're now not able to be afforded? Because this is the question that ratepayers and residents are going to be asking us, and I'm still not able to give a clear answer. Because all the stuff about inflation and renewals and whatever, you're now saying isn't relevant because that's our rates funded, so we don't even have to think about that. So we're now just talking about the cost of growth, the cost of water upgrades that are not nature cause, and other critical upgrades. Have they all gone up so much that we're now having to cut out $4 million of strategic spending?
What I can say is that the inflationary pressures, I guess, that are on renewals and the other parts of the budget do also apply with the loan funded pieces. So there is actually some, I guess, some pretty reasonable increases to the cost of doing something today to what it was 3 years ago. And I think that has started to show its way through in these. Plus, taking Chris's point from earlier, I think there's probably some better known information now around the true cost of constructing and these projects that are now included for your consideration.
Okay, I'll leave it there, thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, I'm going to start off around renewals, and I won't bore you with all my questions. I'll email them to the officers, so some of them are minor. But there was a couple of things, and it was touched on by Councillor Naylor about the mobile big screen replacement. I note there's 2 programs, and I'm only focusing on them because they've got some bigger numbers around them. Is on our spreadsheets, page 4, and our renewals under Arts and Heritage, and it goes community mobile big screen replacement, 150,000. That's obviously our trailered big screen. Yet we have another one in program 2401, which again is mobile community screen upgrade, and that's another 150 in year 4. So, are they the same thing, or is it 2? Are we buying another one? Okay, we've got one of the officers online. We're just going to connect you, John.
Good afternoon, councillors. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. The 2401 program is the one for the mobile big screen that is a trailerised Central Energy Trust branded unit. I can't speak on behalf of one that might be under community development, but certainly I think I have a budget there of 160,000, and that is to completely upgrade and renew the LED components for that mobile screen. And I think in year 4, that's an appropriate time when it will be at the end of good useful life.
Okay, and so the trailer stays and gets its little revamp, and there's a new screen comes into it.
Yes, there's some minor alterations that need to be done to the actual trailer unit itself, just due to, I suppose, dispersion of weight, but it's taking care of that and putting new LED screen.
Okay. And if one of the other officers can come back to me around the other big screen that we're getting. It's program number 1968, Community Mobile Big Screen. Ah, okay. So it's a double up. Okay, it was another screen, but we're not going to do it. Okay, cool, thank you. On a light-hearted number, the city Christmas tree in the square, is that really $100,000? And who's in charge of that one? That's 2364 new Christmas tree.
Through the chair, Donna Baker, Acting CE Unit Manager. Yes, that has been put in as a replacement cost and that has been costed by the events team. Of course, council can choose to do something quite different. I understand in the past we have used a Putakawa tree and just put decorations on it, so it would be a council decision if we go ahead with that or not.
And we currently use the existing false tree, which we've got new parts for, is that right?
That's right, that's been replaced and it went up over the last 2 days.
Right, brilliant, okay. Just on page 5, program 2361 CT Arena, replacement of the grandstand roof, and I know, Bryce, you've spoken to us about that. Sorry, I apologise, you have pushed it out. I was going to ask if you've pushed it out, and you have. Okay. On page 8, program 270, the Holiday Park renewals, and I note there's 300,000 every year through to about year 6, and it drops. Is that when the lease is sort of renewed?
No, the lease will be up for renewal. Well, actually, the current lease will come to an end before that, in about 5 years' time. Essentially, there's a lot of work to be done there, and the assets are failing quicker than we had anticipated. Hence the big increase from previous LDP.
Okay, thank you. In our citywide, on page 9, citywide footpath renewals, program 64, we've bumped that up, and I know that's always we get lots of inquiries about it. Can I just understand from infrastructure, are we actually spending the money? Because there's been some challenges in the past to spend that money. Are we actually doing that?
Yes, we are, and basically that's a good example. There is another program in there that has unsubsidised in the title. So we've actually realigned that program to try and better take advantage of Whakatei funding. So the overall amount isn't actually considerably more than we have in the current year, but we should be able to get 51% funding over all of it.
Great, okay, that's good to hear. And I note that we've got program, page 10, program 2453, citywide transport bridge replacements, and I know they're massively big numbers and they're stuck out in 8, 9 and 10, but Councillor Barrett and I were in front of a whole lot of transport operators screaming at us about non-compliant bridges all over the city, including in the city. Are infrastructure officers aware of all that? I'm sure you are.
Yes, we are, and there's actually several programs in there around structural upgrades and bridge renewals to look to address a number of those problems. That program in particular is more targeted towards big replacements tied up with Pinity. Okay,
cool. And then going to page 11, around wastewater and program number 1380, and also program 2268, which were around the biogas generator. There's quite a lot in there, in fact millions, around major overhauls, and then on the replacement there's also another million. Is that a good, are we getting, I mean that's a generation of income as well, are we getting a good, is it good bang for buck?
So program 138, you're quite right, Mr. Mills, for contract to keep that biogas engine going every couple of years, every 3 to 4 years. It needs a fairly top-end major overhaul, which is, as you say, quite pricey. But yep, it's generating electricity, which is offsetting the purchase of electricity at the wastewater treatment plant.
So any rough numbers? Do we know how, I mean...
I can get numbers to you, but off the top of my head...
That would be helpful. I mean, it's virtually, it looks like we're replacing an Air New Zealand jet engine every couple of years with the numbers, that's all. And I just hope we're getting the money back. No, I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Oh, just one other thing, sorry. With some of our water renewals, this is around our fresh water, some of them are quite pricey. And this is around all of this new water standards. Is there any way we can get an exemption or can we lengthen our, just bearing in mind all the stuff we have to do in waters, really around wastewater mainly, but also stormwater is huge as well. Can we get an exemption for a period
we'll
of time?
certainly be contacting Taumata ROI to have those discussions, and we need to have a plan to them by the end of this financial year, which we're currently working on. Yeah, so, you know, we can't get an exemption, but what we can do is get an enforceable undertaking, which gives us a timeline and a plan to have all these things done by. And we've tried to put this budget together with that in mind.
Okay, thank you, because there's some really, if you add them all up, they're really big numbers, actually. And also, we have quite a big number around page 15, and that's around the telephone system. I think it might be related to the contact centre. Program 2494, it's a couple of 100,000. Is that, am I correct in saying it's the contact centre? Somebody can come back to me, that's fine. Yep. And then
my understanding is that it would be the system for the entire organisation. So it's
okay.
Basically, yeah, replacing getting rid of the PABX and using a Teams bridge instead.
Right, okay. And then on our favourite building here, the cab, 281, on the same page, renewals. Is this, what are we renewing what exactly is that renewing?
Well, over the 10-year period, a whole variety of things. It's a pretty big building with a number of assets. I can give you a bit more detail if you wish. I guess notably that program for about 6 years in a row has been well over $1 million. So it has been scaled right back now to deal with failing assets as opposed to any big fire upgrades or anything like that. That's now all done.
A lot of the floors have been done though, Bryce, but where does this sit in the floors that haven't been done?
It's all over the building really, including in the chamber here, and it covers absolutely everything from lighting to flooring to everything else in between really. Bathrooms. It's a very high level renewal for a very large building.
Okay. All right, I'll leave it at that. I'll put everything back into an email to everybody, so there's a number of other little ones, but I won't bore you with them. Okay, are there any other items or questions around renewals at a high level? Okay. I'm not going to propose that we move anything because I want to have another sleep on this to get my head around the numbers and come back. My intention is to come back Friday and check in with you again, go through any other questions that have come back to the officers. If you have anything, obviously fire them through, and then we'll look at what recommendations we have some comfort with putting up around the renewals, and then we'll move through then to our waters, and then so on to growth. So I think if going into waters, is there any questions on waters that we've still got a bit of time? Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mine was organisational performance, number 58, aerial photography. Over a 10-year period, 621,000. That seems a heck of a lot. Is that just plans and, yeah.
Is it GIS stuff, is it?
Generally, I'll have a crack at it, Councillor Arnott, given that I used to work in this space a little bit. The GIS system requires aerial photography upgrades and those sorts of things and that from time to time, particularly for modelling, things around growth, stormwater modelling and those sorts of things in that as well. So again, it's an area we could probably go back and have a little bit more of a closer look at, but renewing your aerial photography, particularly in the city as it changes from time to time, is worthwhile doing, and it helps with decision support.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Nothing on waters? What about growth? Any other questions on growth? No? Councillor Naylor.
I guess the answer that David gave around a Kotiri transport, the 40 million, that we won't know for another couple of weeks. If we're needing to make decisions on growth on Friday, what's the best way to factor that uncertainty in if we were interested in trying to reduce the overall growth budget through some slowing, as an example?
Yeah, I think by the sessions that we've got scheduled on the 13th and 20th, we'll have a bit more of an indication of how that's tracking through the hearing process. I think it's, in terms of those transport improvements, it is a large sum of money, and it's not shown in there, but the assumption with those, as Cameron said earlier, with that they'd be co-funded through Waka Kotahi. But it would be, rather than removing those, it would be about sort of pushing them out, so some would fall off the 10-year window in terms of the LTP, but you know, as I said, it's looking, all the indications are based on the evidence that's coming through that we'll be able to delay some of that, but it'll just, as I said, by the 13th to 20th, we'd be able to make some adjustments.
Also, just probably adding to that, the other one that we're still waiting some other further advice from, particularly from government about, is the Three Waters. So there is, you know, the decisions that will be made around that will actually determine about a path or a course that we might take over the leading up to signing off for the CD to go
out. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Look, I've just got a general question. It really just follows on, I think, from Councillor Johnson, who was talking about attachment 4 and those programs in there. Have we actually looked at perhaps some principles to apply to that in terms of perhaps trying to define a hierarchy of what is important and what perhaps is a little bit less important?
I think it all comes down to political will, really.
Well, I'm just perhaps just trying to, you know, figure out whether or not there's actually a way of actually trying to actually prioritise some of those off without actually going through it line by line.
I suppose, like we have done in the past, I've always applied the model of, is there partners involved? I.e.
That's the thought that I've had, yes.
Yeah, if there's a partner involved, you've got to look at it pretty closely, because if you make a call, and it's happened to us, where a partner of ours or partners of ours have including government and other government agencies, don't fund something, what does that do to us? So we've probably got to think about that in our decision making. What does that do to our partners if we don't fund something or we change it without talking to them? So that's one way. The officers might have a view. I'm not sure whether there's a more critical sort of ranking system. If wastewater goes above urban design, or I'm not sure.
I can probably add, not necessarily answering that question, but within some of the bigger programs of work, so taking something like Carina, for instance, and the master plan upgrade, which sits in that in that schedule, we have gone through and prioritised all of the different projects within that, so that what the budgets that you see within that 10-year period are essentially the top 5 projects out of all of those projects that make up the master plan. So for a number of those bigger sort of programs, we have sort of looked to take that approach where possible to try and help guide some decision making.
Yeah, thank you. I just thought I'd ask the question because perhaps it might just kind of, people might be able to think about it between now and Friday. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, it was where we've got master plans. Obviously, there's been some work put into to help with prioritisation as well. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and noting Mr. Murphy's advice earlier around the IFF, around the capital growth. If we were to look to bring something else in there, which would be the least bad option?
I mean, looking.
And if you want to bring the answer back to us on Friday, it's fine, but that's my question.
Yeah, I think Friday.
Great. Got it in there. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
All right.
Mr. Mayor.
On that note, I think that'll finish us out. Actually, we'll just move a motion that we'll officially adjourn this till Friday, 10 a.m. I'll look to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Thank you. And we'll look to vote by show of hands. Oh, we can vote online, can we? We can just do it. Okay, we've just done it. It's good. I like this executive power. It's good. Thank you. In all seriousness, though, please, if you do have questions, can you get them to the officers? And I think in fairness around transparencies, link in your colleagues, because I think then we all know where we're heading, because there may be 2 of you thinking the same and you don't cross paths. So I think that's wise. I think we've all understand what we're trying to do here is to try and get the best, but there are some challenges along the way. So let's see if we can work through the first stage of it anyway on Friday, and get through at least the first couple, maybe 3 appendix, and we'll just see where we go. I'll just let Wade finish out.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Just with your questions and that, we will really appreciate it. If there's some things that have kind of left not quite answered for you today, please write those down and get those sent to, and I'd suggest that send the questions to David, Cam, Chris and Copy and myself as well, as well as Grant's mentioned about the other elected members as well, and just so that we get across those, and when we come back in here again, we can cover off those things that might be still sitting in your head a little bit as well, before we get going again.
Karen.
Sorry, just another question. Is there any modelling that we can see of what this looks like in terms of rates increase over the 10-year period, based on the capital program that's been outlined with these appendices?
because we're still refining, working through the operating budget as a whole, it's really quite difficult to then actually model the rates impact of just the debt alone, because it depends on how the whole program moves, and any decisions that are made fundamentally will impact as well on that picture. So I guess what I tried to articulate in an email to a question last night was around what is the impact if that particular scenario played out, i.e. year-on-year rates impact of the debt alone. Because there's other impacts as well, because certain programs have operating impacts. That's not just debt.
Yeah. So I guess the assumptions that are already in this paper, like the 8.5% for the year one, and the assumptions that have been made in this paper of Appendix 1, 2 and 3 and 100k of Appendix 4, it would be nice to see what that looked like in terms of rates and correct. If we haven't got it, we haven't got it, but that's something that I feel like would be useful to help inform our thinking or decision making.
Okay, all right, thank you. Could I ask the Deputy Mayor just to close out with a karakia?
Tēnā koe, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to end with a karakia that I think is possibly more aspirational. And with that in mind, with Friday. And I'll read the English translation and then I'll finish with the Māori translation and you'll understand why I said that. To move into the world of light and understanding, lock it in together, assent by all. That's the aspirational part. Kia puta ki te whai au ki te ao marama. Whakamaua kia tina, haumi e hui e tāiki e. Tēnā koutou. Thank you.
Kia ora. Look, thanks everybody. It has been a slow start, but I think we're